Afternoon. At this time, we'd like to call to order the Palo Alto City Council Finance Committee meeting for Tuesday, August 6th, 2024. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Vinker.
Here.
Councilmember Burt.
Here.
Vice Mayor Lowing.
Here.
All present.
Good. So we have opportunity for the public to comment on any items that are not on the agenda but are within the purview of this committee. Do we have any speakers?
We do not.
Okay. So we'll go on to our single action item this afternoon, which is to review and discuss the funding level of the Human Services Resource Allocation Process and other grants in the general fund and potential recommendation to City Council. Who gets to kick this off? Oh, there we go.
Okay, here we go. Great. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Lupita Alamos, Assistant to the City Manager. And with me today is Minka Vanderswag. I'm sorry, Minka, Human Services Manager, and also Lauren Line here, Chief Financial Officer. So now that I've properly butched both names, we can continue with the presentation. So I do apologize for that. So today's presentation and discussion is focused on the human services funding level. And next slide, please. As a refresher, this is focused on Council's referral from the fiscal year 24 adopted budget to focus the evaluation of HISRAP funding as a percentage of the general fund. Next slide. And just to recap, this is a continuation from the March 19th discussion from the Finance Committee, which did receive information and discussed the HISRAP funding, but also took the discussion to a broader umbrella to include a discussion on all human services agreements and grants, and asked that staff come back with additional information to help inform policy and decisions around that. So specifically, the committee asked that staff come back with the definition of human services, the HISRAP proposal evaluation criteria, information on the HISRAP process, as well as additional financial information for other human services, and specifically those outlined and bulleted in the previous staff report to include, for example, Avenidas, downtown streets, environmental volunteers, life moves, et cetera. And those are also captured in the staff report. Next slide. So to start with the, just very briefly, just the human services definition, very general and broad to include safety net services to the community that include children, youth, teens, seniors, people with disabilities, and the unhoused. And then further augmented by what the human services needs assessment identifies. And those are bulleted on this slide and then further fleshed out as linked in the report. So this is how the HISRAP utilizes and defines human services as well. Next slide. And then for the HISRAP proposal evaluation criteria, that was also linked in the report, but essentially, as discussed by Minka in our last meeting, the evaluation criteria is modeled after our city's procurement processes. And then also listed in the staff report are the 11 criteria considerations that range from alignment with community services, organizational effectiveness, measurements for success, accessibility and affordability of programs, amongst a whole list that you can review in the report. Next slide, please. And then also included in the report is now updated with those nonprofits that were specifically outlined in the previous staff report. And I just do want to call to attention that in fiscal year 25, I misrepresented the total HISRAP grant allocation. Listed there is $885,076, and we know that this amount is now 919 and 644. That change has only a minimal amount of change to the total percent of the general fund for HISRAP and total funding. So for HISRAP, it goes from 0.31% of the general fund listed on the table to 0.33%. And as a total funding, as a percent of total funding, it goes from 2.81 that's listed there to 2.83. So it's a minor discrepancy, but still wanted to call that. That was not the final allocation amount. Next slide. So also included in that table and as requested by the Finance Committee, this only includes those human services and other nonprofit organizations as listed in that report. It is not a comprehensive list of all human service grants and agreements. So it doesn't include any lease subsidies, any ad hoc cultural or special event contributions that might fall under the umbrella. It doesn't include, for instance, the requests from Magical Bridge, et cetera. It only limits it to those that were as part of the staff report. And as you can see from that table, from fiscal year 2015 to 25 overall, including HISRAP, Avenidas, PAC, and other human services, as a percent of the general fund expenditures, it shows an average of 1.3% allocated. And then for fiscal year 26 and 27, those projected numbers show that human services funding would be approximately 1.3% of the general fund budget expenditures. So when we look at these averages, historically, for the last 10 years, we would exceed that 1% of the general fund. Next slide. So in light of us exceeding that 1% of the general fund, staff would recommend that instead of making a policy change where we are already exceeding that amount, that we would instead focus on providing the council with a human services funding report, including but not limited to HISRAP as part of the annual budget process. So we have a better understanding and view of how much the city invests in these very valued organizations and services to the community. So with that concludes my presentation.
Great.
I just had one clarification
Yeah,
question.
go ahead.
On the slide, I believe it was 8. I didn't quite understand what your first bullet point when you said what it doesn't include. You mentioned Magical Bridge. Why wouldn't it include that?
We did not include this, or we did not take the assignment to include all of human services. First of all, we haven't defined what that means. And so what we did was just even take as a start those that were listed in the staff report. And we can see that even with just those that are listed, we already exceed that 1%. If we were to do a comprehensive evaluation of all the money that we give, it would exceed that by far.
Well, but maybe we should. So that's something we should discuss.
Yeah, and that one, that's kind of an easily identifiable. I'm also surprised that that's not included. But anyway, we can talk about that more. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak?
No, we do not.
Okay, well then let's come back here for discussion. Vicki, did you start?
Sure. And I'm glad we're talking about this today. I think that how we treat the neediest in our community says a lot about us and our values. But they're tricky, difficult issues, hard to define, as has already come up. So I think this is a great start. And I understand that there will be later discussions on nonprofits more generally, which I'm also eager to have. I think part of the trick today is knowing where this discussion stops and that one starts, because there strikes me as there's substantial overlap, but I think I still understand the assignment. A couple of quick questions off the bat. On slide 4, entitled Human Services Definition, And we just talked about the difficulty of defining human services. And you have the definition you read at the first bullet point. What is the source of that? Because I have to say, I went today and just sort of Googled it to say what all in there. There's a lot of different definitions out there. So I'm just curious where we pull that from.
I can do that, but my speaker does not seem to be.
You can try this one.
Okay, I'll use this for now or I'll scooch over. So the first one is just what's included in the budget book when it talks about human services, or like in the comprehensive plan when it talks about human services. That's just the very general definition that we use. The second one is from, I'm sorry,
I
Councilor.
was gonna say, I totally get what the second one is. I was
Okay.
just curious. So the first one is what we put in our budget as a city kind of.
If someone asked me to do a real quick one over of what human services is, that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you. And then now I'm to a quick numbers question. I'll go from one extreme to the other. So on the chart on on slide 5, the human services funding table. And you called our attention to FY 2025. And I think we all understand that the big number under other general fund human services funding, that 5.8 million, is largely because of the Life Moves investment we're making in this fiscal year. And then I know thereafter there's maybe about $1 million to Life Moves. Can you give us then the percents when we go to the far right and we have the HISRAP percent, which excludes that 1.9 million, and then we have the total funding that includes it. Can you give us that intermediate number of what it would be without the Life Moves, but with the other? You know what I'm saying?
So yes, thank you for that. So that number is accurately reflected as 1.33%.
So in the slide, not on the chart.
Um,
'Cause here I see 1.41 and 1.42.
oh, yeah, so it would be then, I'm sorry, let me go back. Apologies. Wrong spot.
So in other words, I'm looking
Yeah,
at,
so it would be 1.41. So once we take out,
I think I'm asking. a
okay, I'm
different
sorry,
question.
let me listen to your question again.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead and maybe you were answering it.
May I attempt to paraphrase? the
Okay.
request? I think the request is in the table with the figures. Sorry.
Getting back to it, right? Let me attempt to paraphrase the request. I believe the request is in that table. Can we determine the percentage excluding Life Moves?
Exactly.
Okay, give us a minute.
Just because it's a big bolus. And I think that, we may or may not want to include it, but we should know what it looks like if we don't. That's all.
Can I
So
just add a note on Life Moves, which is that we also should segregate the capital investment from the operating. Capital is a one-time, and it kind of begs the question of, as we are looking more comprehensively at there are other times where we may have capital projects, and that's different from our operating expenses.
that's a good point. And so if you only remove the capital, because that's really what I'm getting at. So thank you.
So if we were to only remove the capital, that is correct, and to reflect the 1.41 reflects just the 1 million moving forward from Life Moves. So it doesn't include the initial investment of 4 million. It now just reflects the 1 million in operating moving forward, if that
So
makes sense.
let me just double
Oh.
check that, because I think it's what's shown in Life Moves to confirm in FY 25 is 5 million for Life Moves.
Yes,
And FY 26 is 1 and beyond is 1 million.
correct.
So
So that it's a different number. I'm still not getting my question through. Let me try one more time to
Okay.
ask it better. All right. There's HISRAP
Mhm,
dollars.
mhm,
There is the Avenidas and PACC, and there's the other general fund human services funding.
mhm.
In the other general fund human services funding for 2026 and 2027, I'm under the impression that about 1 million of the approximately 2 million is capital for Life Moves. Is that correct? That is not correct.
No,
it's operating
It's all operating. Okay.
for Life Moves.
Okay, so then let me ask a new question. Can you give me the number, the percentage without the Life Moves operating? Thank you for that. Which I can ballpark is, no, I won't. And while she's calculating, are those, is the operating for Life Moves the operating for the transitional housing, or is it other other operational expenses as well?
I believe it's
Just-
just the operating for
just-
Project Home Key.
That's what I'm, thank you. And that, because it's one big item, I'd just like to know when it's in and out, what impact that has. That's why I'm asking. And then I can yield after that. I have more, but I've taken some time. If you want to go ahead and then give us that.
While we're doing that, first on the Life Moves, FY25, does that include 4 million capital and 1 million operating? Or is it all capital on FY25?
Question.
Fiscal 25's number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It includes 4,944,000. So I'm not sure who knows the component of 4,944,000. So Paul, you have revised numbers?
Let's not, because I'm making edits at the same time. I
Okay.
think that our budget team is, so I'm going to step away.
Yeah, no, I've learned to.
Because we are going to be operating in FY25, so I was assuming there are some operating dollars.
Project Home Key. We hope they're operating balance, but
So, excuse me, Paul Harper, Office of Management and Budget. The 4.9 million is what we have programmed for the capital project in 2025. And then we also have another, sorry, I'm looking at our chart. We should have another 1 million that we programmed in the budget on the operating side, but I need to confirm that. So I'm sorry, the capital project is the 4.9 million. Let me look at the operating side real quick. Sorry.
Yeah, and then we may want to make sure that that's in the table, both things, yeah.
yeah, I'm wondering if it's a smaller number because I don't know when it'll kick in within the FY, but not, so it might not be the full million.
It wouldn't be an annual, yeah,
Right,
amount, yeah.
right. So that might be harder to recognize because it's smaller.
Okay,
Well, it's not starting today. We don't have operating today because it's not up and running.
So it may not be as immediate,
It may be so, and
it's a
therefore
fraction of
smaller.
a year's worth of operating costs.
Right.
but I
Right.
believe we still have that commitment.
Oh, yeah, yeah. But you're not looking for $1 million probably, I would guess. That's what
From a timeline perspective.
Right, because he's looking for FY 2025.
Mhm.
So it's probably not $1 million. That's all. Okay. If you want, I'll just
Go ahead.
hold there and, okay. See if I can find back to my other questions. Sorry, I should have lost my plate here. You know, I'm gonna hold for now, Chair, just, thank you.
Just overall question if you want.
Questions?
Yeah,
Comments?
Okay, so one of the things we were looking at, is this operative? Okay, great. One of the things we were looking at is what are the criteria for his rep, and I think it's pretty good. And I was glad to see that one of the big components was item number 5, which is that a significant proportion of service funding must be from non-city of Palo Alto funds. Because that was a concern that if that's not a criteria, you know, all donors to nonprofits shouldn't be created equal, or some phrase like that, meaning we should supplement, not be a major provider.
Right.
With certain exceptions, like obviously Avenidas is a huge exception.
Right. Well, Avenidas, we're still about 8% of their total budget. At this time, it used to be about 10, but now what I hear from their CEO is we're down to 8. And yeah, and the reason for that is we don't want, if, for instance, the city goes through a huge financial downfall, that the ability of the program to operate is so severely compromised because we were the majority funder and they didn't have a diversified funding source.
Right. And to the broader point, as we already have discussed, the goal was to see if, 1% was the right guideline. In some years, we've almost tripled that in terms of our forecast. So that would be a fundamental thing we have to decide today. If we want to be doing according to a percentage that's the target and a guideline, or if we want to do with the new staff recommendation. So
I think that'll be part of the deeper discussion, but bear in mind that we've broadened the scope of what's included here too from our traditional definition.
yeah,
So we changed the definition and the dollar amount changed too.
yeah, in the different columns. When we get to the organization of it, I think, I don't know how much detail we want to get into, but when we look at the H rep, I always have trouble with that word, his rep, and the process and so on. How much interaction do we want with the Human Relations Commission? I mean, do we want sort of final approval? Do we want to start with that? So there's some detail that we could jump into there, but I don't know if you want to get to that today. So those are just sort of some top line comments.
I'll start with a few things. First, I think this exercise is an ongoing process. We're not there yet, but it's really valuable that we have gone from kind of narrowly defining what we're looking at to fairly broadly, but not yet comprehensively. And I think it's a really important way for us to step back and look at this more comprehensively rather than we get consumed in the weeds. Really, they're important weeds, but we shouldn't call it in the flowers, we'll call it. So I'm really pleased that we're going through this. The one when I was looking at the supplemental list on page 2, these are all no, I guess they're which of these are included in the dollar amount, because PATMA is not, and we've already said Magical Bridge isn't listed here, but it should be on this list. But which of these are included in the dollar amount?
PATMA is included in the dollar amount. So
Oh,
all of those are, yes.
Oh, I thought I read.
No, it's just that I was calling out that in previous years, so those PATMA has been funded through I think the transportation fund, whereas I believe in 24 and 25, there's a higher general fund contribution to PATMA.
Okay, so that raises a point that there are some categories that are not clearly in one bucket or another. PATMA is still a transportation entity that has a valuable human service component. Downtown Streets team, depending on who you ask, is either a social service predominantly or a service that basically is a supplementing public works and economic development that has a strong social service component. From the Downtown Streets team's perspective, they are principally a social service organization. So they would say, oh yeah, but there are other ways in which it meets different city objectives and priorities. So I think we may want to put a grouping that is those entities that are in part social service, and that part may be majority or minority, and we can just kind of work through that over time, but start by moving them into a category that causes us to think it through and say, okay, how would we categorize these? Magical Bridge, I put in that as it's 100%, and it's one of our strongest ways in which we actually meet special needs children and adults, and it actually meets a number of the HISRP objectives as well. So let's see. Oh, when I was looking through the HISRIP criteria, number 3, let's see, is Palo Alto residents are the beneficiaries. And that caused me to think about 2 aspects of that. One is that I don't know that we want to so narrowly define that. At a minimum, we may want to look at Palo Alto workers, people who work in the city but are in need of these sorts of services. And historically, we've had crossover with county social service programs that even went into East Palo Alto under really the what I've always thought of is that we are 2 cities, 2 counties, and 1 community. And I think it's, legally there's a demarcation, but socially, I don't think of it as striking. And then let's see. And then when we talk about Palo Altans as the beneficiaries, it sounds like what we mean here is that the direct beneficiaries. And then we have indirect beneficiaries through programs. So if you take, for an example, we had a discussion at Ada's Cafe around HISRIP funding, and HRC had kind of narrowly said, well, how many Palo Alto residents are directly served by this program? And for what we as a committee and a lot of the council said, well, wait a minute, something's missing here. And what was missing is the way in which Ada's Cafe brings the entire community engaged with those disabled adults and builds the empathy and the social integration that we have with them, and that we all benefit from that. And that's an indirect benefit that's not, it is social related. And so that's looking one next layer outward from that direct benefit. But I think we want to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have been thinking about that. I think what I would say is I'll continue to think about that. And I've already been looking at some other sources to see how they would measure something like that. I think what you have to do, though, to be as objective as possible with these evaluation criteria, it has to be some kind of objective measurement that they can respond to, because I think you can pick any of the HISRAP grantees and you can say, well, seeing the downtown streets team, being on the team is a benefit for the participants, but having the community see unhoused individuals who have pride of work and are, having these interactive conversations with the community, that is also a social benefit. So I think, I am intrigued by the concept. I'm not against it, but I just, as the supervisor of this program, just want to find a way of doing that the HRC can feel like at the end of the day, yes, we can take something like that into account, but we feel like we did it in an objective way, not just because they knew one program better than the other.
But I would argue that all these decisions are a combination of objective and subjective criteria. They are not purely, I don't see anything here that is formulaic based on quantitative criteria, and that those quantitative criteria capture the whole picture. We have, and that's how we make all kinds of decisions. We kid ourselves and we'll say, oh, I've established these quantitative criteria and they'll make the decision for me. And then we look at that and go, somehow something's wrong there. It's not coming to the right conclusion. And that's because it's not easy to have quantitative criteria for all those things.
I hear you. I just, my only concern is sometimes, again, what comes into play is the greater knowledge of one organization by reviewers than the other. And then some bias does come into play. So it's intriguing. It's something I'll continue to think about, but those are just the initial thoughts that I have about it.
Yeah, but I would argue that to some degree, that same issue applies to the criteria we have right now, that it is influenced by the familiarity of HRC members. It's not determined by it, but it's influenced by that. And that's understandable. I'm not saying that shouldn't exist. We all have our points of view and points of reference, our backgrounds that give us more or less familiarity, and that influences what we value. And to claim that that's out of the picture, I don't think is realistic. And so I would say, we want to have as objective a criteria as possible. We want to have a thoughtful process for thinking about whether always go about the process of re-examining the criteria and say, did we get it right? And the answer is usually mostly, and we just learned some things. And maybe we need to refine the criteria because we've reflected and learned. And what we learned may have been because an exception came forward and said, wait a minute, this should fit somehow, and it didn't. What's wrong with the criteria? We have to be willing to just step back and go, okay, good. We keep getting better at it as a result of reflecting that way. I'm not saying it's a simple answer, but I think it's an important one. And I wasn't saying that we should immediately adopt X or Y criteria. What I was saying was that the way in which what we saw with ADAs, and I think your example on Downtown Streets team is another good one, where how do we think more broadly about how these programs affect our community socially, directly and indirectly? Yeah, Vicky?
Yeah, following up on that briefly, and then I'll come back to the dollars thing. Yes, and that's why I was asking at the outset about the nonprofit study that's coming up in this the study session. I think that it's hard to draw a clear line anytime we have a set of rules, and hard to make the best rules. That's why Molly and I can have jobs, is because we write laws in this country. We don't always agree on what they mean in a particular situation. So I think that's why this discussion is so valuable. But I understand that you want to start with something. You want to start with some rules so people have some expectation in common. And then if they're off, we adjust, or, we interpret them as best we can. But so I do think there's a lot of overlap with broader services, some of which are human services. And I want to come back to that in a minute. But the reason I was asking about the dollars figure is I think that I do want the city to get, credit, so to speak, for all of the human services work we do. And certainly the Project Home Key is something we're all very proud of and fits in that category. But it is a big bolus of numbers. And so we understand about the 4.9 million of capital in FY 2025. And we understand there's roughly $1 million of operating expenses ongoing in 26 and 27. And my rough math would be that if we pulled those out, that $1 million each year would be around the 1% mark. And that's why I'm asking. So am I close to right? Do you have a number now, or? Because I'm just taking from the total funding of roughly 4 million in 26 and 27. We take out $1 million. We have 3 million. 3/4 of 1.4 is roughly 1. So that's my point, is that we may want to say as a committee that 1.4 is too high or not. But what I want to point out is that we're still doing the 1% without that. And maybe sometimes big projects like that just have to not be included in our 1%, because we're going to want to take care of the year in, year out typical needs at that 1% level. That's why I'm wondering if that number's in that ballpark.
So if we look at fiscal 25, excluding that 4.9 million, then we're at 1.06% for that
That's
year.
pretty close.
Correct. And then for the 10-year average from 2015 through 2025, that 10-year period, we're at about 1.11%.
And I would guess if we run 26 and 27, it's all going to be hovering around the 1%. So I just think that's an interesting benchmark to take note of, because then we have the life moves on top. We can do what we want with it, in terms of what we should do. But I'm just trying to say, without this big new expenditure, where were we?
But let me add that when we were talking about 1%, it was based upon a certain definition of what would be included. We've changed the definition of what is included. We've broadened it, and we have a bigger number, and we just have a bigger conversation. And once we broaden, and staff rightly pointed out, said, well, wait a minute, those aren't the only things we do in human services. And that broadened it. Well, then we're comparing to a historic point at which we didn't include those other things. It's an apples to oranges comparison. So I'm not really very concerned about, in fact, I don't even think it's very relevant to use a 1% in the conversation once we've broadened what we've included. It just becomes a conversation about, let's look at what we're funding in these areas in different kind of categories and kind of concentric rings, and have a comprehensive discussion about what do we think we should be doing and what can we afford to do. And I don't think we're going to be able to make valuable comparisons retrospectively based on 1% when we changed the scope of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And so I really thank you for doing the calculation, but I wasn't really looking for the 10-year one. I was just looking for the 2025, 26, and 27, just so I could know how much this one decision affected the numbers, because I think that is instructive as opposed to a whole lot of smaller decisions. But I want to go back for a moment to the point that Chair Burt was making, because it is hard to do this line drawing. And I do think there are a lot of additional groups that contribute indirectly. And it's why I have real trouble separating this conversation from the broader nonprofit conversation. But I know we're talking about the HISRAP funding, and so we have to try. But for example, we talk about we say the updated table is not a comprehensive list of all human services, as it does not generally include facility lease subsidies or community well-being and belonging events such as Third Thursdays, Mayfest Parade, et cetera. And I like that phrase, community well-being and belonging events. That sort of bridges a little bit, perhaps beyond the direct services. But when we think about groups that help with community building, things like UNAF, we don't necessarily think of as human services, direct services, but they're on your list there, and they certainly are, community building. Neighbors Abroad, Sibling Cities, all of those groups are aimed at developing a sense of civic responsibility and relationship. And I can tell you that in terms of community building, one of the unexpected benefits of the Sibling Cities experience was that we brought together all kinds of different groups in the community that were very siloed to do services. And all of a sudden you've got, Rotary and League of Women Voters and the Chambers and Stanford sitting in one room and talking. So it's a different kind of, it's not the direct services we typically think of, but I think it's certainly community building. And a lot of people thought, oh, I've heard about you for so long. It's nice to be talking to you. So there's this continuum, or concentric rings. I like that too. But I think, and I'm not necessarily saying that those are HISRAP fund appropriate, but I think this conversation to try to set some more parameters and description and what do we want to do is a real valuable one. And when we get to the definition in the slides, it seems it is narrower than that. And so we just have to figure out how we want to
Right. And obviously that definition was created without any of these other programs and services in mind.
I'll also note that I think the buckets we look at is important because, as noted in the agenda report, one major component that was pulled out, right? Avenidas was pulled out in 2016, and that's $500,000, right? So I think this broader discussion is helpful in the spirit of what we're trying to achieve with our city finances.
What did you say about 16 and Avenue?
Yeah, Avenidas and Palo Alto Community Child Care PAC were pulled out of HISRAP at their request at that time. And now they're direct services contracts, which is a lot more relevant to the services that they're providing. And
Okay, I just want to be clear on what you
sure, in
said.
2004, the same thing happened for Project Sentinel, which is also providing services on behalf of the city for the Palo Alto mediation program.
Which is interesting, you know, this year we created this special fund for some of these community
events.
partners that didn't fit well into his rep or otherwise. And to see that we actually have done that a number of times. And then once it becomes established that they are in their own category, we don't think twice about it. But one of the things that I think is useful here is then to go back and look systematically at what we're doing and say, okay, one, to appreciate it, and second, to say, does it seem right? And I think in general it does, and we've added some in recent years. We've added funding for the HISREP and added funding for some of these other standalone programs on top of what we had done before, and Avenidas and PAC, and we said, well, of course we don't go through HISREP, and well, we used to. And in fact, going back further, we used to, the senior services were part of the general fund that we operated before Avenidas did. And one of the important things to recognize, and as time goes on, we often lose sight of that, is that whether the human service programs or others, some of the most valuable nonprofits in our community were spinoffs, and that in other cases, some other cities either don't provide that service or they provide it directly. And we've, over time, that's what, in fact, was TheaterWorks, I believe, was originally a city function. It was not Palo Alto Players. I think it was TheaterWorks. So once they've been standalone for a long time, we sometimes start going, well, they got to compete with everybody else, and go, no, we had a deal 40, 50 years ago that said, we'll spin you off. We'll no longer spend as much as we did, but we'll continue to support you as a partner. You know, we did that with Project Safety Net that was fully city funded for years. And they spun off. And so that's maybe another category that we should just look at so that we are aware of it, of which of these community partners were, or in other circumstances, are city funded, administered functions in other cities, but that we actually have an advantage of that you know, Avenidas today, they're doing more, and our share is a smaller and smaller proportion of their budget. That's a great thing. And that goes to what Minka was talking about earlier, which is not only do we want to make sure that they have the financial stability to withstand any disruptions we may have in our budget, but they enter into a maturity where they're leveraging the city dollars as highly valuable to be able to solicit other funds, but we're not their backbone of the funding. We're the seed. So I'm thinking about the kind of next step is, you know, it's in advance of this next year, this FY26 budget. We are not in a rush to do this, but I think we want to move this ball forward some. This has been a great next step. I think we do want to break these down and add some things in and break down categories. In my mind, the capital, we may want a couple different spreadsheets depending on how much granularity we want. Certainly one where we break down capital from operating. Another where we may break down some of the major partners, you know, like Life Moves, like Avenidas. I say Life Moves because Home Key was the primary state funding, but now as it becomes operational, it's the Life Moves as the partner rather than Home Key. And then making sure that and then this category of partners who are not wholly or primarily human services, but have a significant component to what they do as human services. And then these others that are
Adjacent.
community building, is that? the way-
Community, yeah, and civic responsibility.
Yeah, and they build our social fabric, and I don't know how to best title them, but a category for those that are not within what we would properly describe in this human services definition. And I think that it not only will help inform us for budgeting and priorities, it'll also, we as a city and a council and a community really don't have a comprehensive look at this, and we're starting to. This is really creating a foundation. All we had was some significant blocks out of it, like his rep was a major block, and we could see that clearly. But the rest of stuff was all kind of scattered, and now we're really looking, and out of that we can then do a gap analysis and say, all right, okay, are there things that are not fitting here or that we need? I don't think that we have great gaps in terms of functions that aren't being addressed, but that's, you step back and open up that conversation, and people come forward with thoughtful input on that. So I think this is kind of really moving that step forward, and our next cut at it will be both deeper and more systematic and comprehensive. It's what feels like we're headed.
A question, if I may. So for his rep, can entities apply for both operating and capital, or is it just operating?
We're just operating. We don't, if someone wants capital, if it's for a project, I usually push them towards CDBG.
Okay, that makes sense. And part of it is I wanted to, we haven't talked about ability path and where they fit in the groupings. And so I'm just curious about my colleagues' thoughts on that.
Well, I think they're human service, but not something that could be funded through the his rep. And I think we still, we got a kind of a last minute proposal and got some additional information on it. Kind of at the budget hearing, but it was too late. And we said that we would take a harder look. I don't know if we've received a better explanation of the context for this and the accountability on, where this come from, why. And I will add that one other concern I had was an issue of at Mitchell Park Place, what were the conditions of approval that were stated on how that space would be used, and is this a change in those conditions?
Yes, and not to dive too deeply into the specifics, because quite frankly, I may not be as up to speed as other conversation staff has had, but I believe there actually was an evolution in our understanding where originally we thought it was capital, but ultimately it was not. It was staffing up for the purpose of establishing a new program that also raised some questions on how it integrated or dovetailed with existing funding provided for existing programs. So it I think is in a bit of a chicken and the egg question as to how to best tackle it. To the extent it is services, it may very well fit within the HISRAP program. And one of the questions we had was the timing of their funding need, and some question of the request coming now versus when it would open, which would presumably be about a year from now, as I recall, and how immediate was that need. So I think depending on the outcome of this discussion, we would want to have some follow-up with them. Again, the chicken and egg problem is where if it does fit within our program or the HISRAP program, just as an example, then what's the timing opportunity for them to apply there versus the cycle that we're on?
Didn't they have, wasn't there some other monies that was given to them outside of the matching grant request?
The only money that Ability Path that I know has received is the HISRAP, which is about 80,000. And they also got an emerging needs grant, which was about 10,000. That's what I know in the last couple of years.
So, but there was a HISRAP grant to them, and
Oh,
so.
of course,
there-
they've been a long
Yeah,
time HISRAP
exactly.
grantee.
So my point is they kind of know that whole process, and this was outside of that process. So I think the question is, do we say to them, well, we don't just take these one-off independent ones, or there's an alternative process, or, wait and come back for this one and it's a additional request. That's kind of what I'm wondering process-wise, what people think.
And first clarifying question, is their request an ongoing amount or a one-time amount?
I think that was one of the clarifications we were seeking. It wasn't entirely clear, since to the extent it was to fund staff, that's typically considered an ongoing expense, and what would happen after the initial or if the requests were satisfied, what would their plan be for sustaining that expenditure?
And I don't recall when they came forward, first, we weren't sure if it was capital. I don't recall them ever communicating that it was an ongoing operating expense of what, $250,000 a year? Is that what it was?
I'm not sure how much of it was one time versus ongoing.
And then when I was saying that it may not fit in his rep, it wasn't, I also said that it seems to fit under human services. The reason I said not under his rep, one was whether it was one time, and if it's ongoing, then more so. But second, it would break the bank on his rep unless there was additional funding. And all these other programs would need to be cut back if we were to reallocate that much, such a high percentage. I mean, we just, a couple of years ago, that would have been almost half of his rep right there.
So that begs the question of whether another criterion that we should add to his wrap is they need to be between X and Y dollars. We're not going to consider a $500 request, but we're not going to consider a $500,000 request. Do we do that now?
The only thing we do right now is on the lower end, like no grant, under 5,000 will be considered. And often new grantees, we start them at the $5,000 range because we want to see if they can effectively manage that.
Sure.
But there is no upper one. They average from 30 to 50. I would say the two largest grants at this point are Life Moves and Ability Path.
Yeah. So I saw on here, when I'm looking at the staff report, how complete the RFP is. I don't think I've ever seen the RFP, so I don't know what all goes into it that's communicated to the applicant. But a lot of times with grants, they'll say either an upper limit, or they'll say, typically our grants have ranged from X to Y, just something to set an expectation.
That could easily be added. Like I said, at this point, we only have the lower level. We do have a pre-meeting ahead of any RFP time. And that is a great time that we communicate this extra information, but I could easily put that in the RFP.
Yeah, having filled out a few grant applications, I look at that when I do. And if it's not there, sometimes I'll take the time and research it and see what their grants have been. But that's a hassle. So if it's just right there at the beginning, it tells people if they're going to be sort of out of the ballpark, that they either better be pretty special or they better realize it may be aspirational. So, thank you.
Yeah, a few comments in response to this. I think one of I was going to mention the gap situation. When we do a survey of what we're spending our money, we're placing our bets where we're helping people. We want to make sure there aren't any gaps that we're missing. Are we underfunding the disabled need in the community, or the homeless need, or whatever it is? So, and perhaps there's no problem at all, which is great. But as part of this process, I think we should look for the gaps. But the other side of the gaps is we got to look for overlaps. If we're already investing in 3 things that take care of the homeless, then maybe that gets lower priority for his rep or other things. So those are some of the hard decisions I think that we need to start taking. If we're going to, I think we should each year have a dollar cap, however we get there, whether it's a dollar number or whether we come up with a percentage that's a guideline. Because as I've said before, there's unlimited demand for city funds, and we have to draw a line somewhere, because we're not primarily an organization that sort of just does grants. We should do that. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. And to some extent, everything we do is services to our community, from homeless to electricity. So it fits. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing any of this, but I just think we have to be cautious at figuring out how we spread that amongst the real needs. And I do think we should, why we came into this with 1% is because it gives us a guideline to look at, as opposed to saying, well, but this, it's going over, but they really need this 200,000. And you do that 5 times and you spend an extra $1 million. So I think in responsibility to our citizens, we want to try to stay away from that. And just a kind of a footnote on Ability Path, that's not agendized today in terms of who else we're going to make grants to, but there was some narrative going around like we were stiffing them or something. And in fact, they're one of the largest grants. So, we got to be careful of folks that are saying we really need this, particularly if we already contributed to them. So if we could get to, and the other thing is, in terms of no matter how we classify this, you have to be this or this or this. Any nonprofit that would like us to help is going to find a way for themselves to fit into one of those classifications. So, however we sort them out for our own benefit, they will prepare their application to try to qualify, which they should. So, just that's the purpose of why we're doing this, is to try to come up with a good set of criteria to be fair to all the applicants and to kind of spread out our sort of contributions to these really important organizations.
Couple other thoughts. One is that I hate to break these into more subcategories, but as we look through the human services definition, and then we have this laundry list of entities that we're funding, I think we may want to try to break them into those categories more clearly. And I assume staff already kind of does, but out of this definition, which of these initiatives serve which of these 7 categories there? So that we begin to look at, well, how much are we spending on homeless through which are the different programs? Then I had another question. Mika, I think you said someone did Avenidas is one of the biggest recipients on his not Avenidas, excuse me, Life Moves. And is that the existing Life Moves programs?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
So,
at the Opportunity Center.
yeah. And that's the point I want to make, is that we now need to look at making a distinction between what we've had as the ongoing small share of the cost of
Exactly.
Opportunity Center versus what we're doing at the transitional housing site. And the Opportunity Center was really designed as transitional housing to a great degree as well. So struggling with how they'd be in a similar broad category, but we need to think through, okay, what's the relationship between what are the various programs we have for the unhoused? And then we also list as a bullet children and youth programs. And can you explain a little bit on what's in the human service children and youth programs versus all the other youth programs that we do? We have children's theater, we have the children's museum and zoo, we have all kinds of recreation, middle school athletics. So that, just saying that it creates some ambiguity.
That's just his rap.
Well, and I think, Chair, to your point, in the metaphor of the concentric circles, and now you've just touched on the services provided directly by the city.
Right.
And also that fit this definition of human services. So really a question of at what point in terms of the scope.
Community services.
Yes, yes, exactly. In a broadest term.
Attempts to define this where, we have, this was helpful to get this definition, but categorically, several of these are clear, but that one doesn't. It seems like we need to refine what portion of children and youth programs are within the human services scope versus all children and
Well, I
youth
think
programs.
as a practical matter, and Kristen, you could correct me if I'm incorrect here, but it's largely excluding what's provided directly by the city. So the definition here is simply to provide a category of grant making, again, distinct from the services provided directly by the city.
Okay, but we don't give grants to Little League and soccer leagues and all those things. So there are certain reasons
point.
based on our criteria that we look at his rep grants for youth and children
Oh,
programs.
I see the point. Kristen, would you like to weigh in on that?
I don't really have much to add. Kristen O'Kane, Community Services, like City Manager Shikata said, anything that we're providing to the community is a direct service from our department, from the city's general fund budget, as you know, and through fees for service. And then any grants that are coming through the application process are through his rep.
But my point is that I think what we're looking at in this category is not anything that's not directly provided from the city, because Little League or soccer or whatever would not be eligible. It's within meeting certain human services criteria that are youth and children related. And that's what I'm saying we aren't explaining here.
Well,
Yeah.
It might be worth just to tease that out a bit, to draw the distinction and explain the distinction. And I'll take a shot at it, which is that in contrast to what we fund through his rep, Little League or other athletic programs are financially self-sustaining. And so, and also, they're self-sustaining as they're able to identify their own revenue sources to continue. In contrast, the programs that we fund through his rep are targeting both children and perhaps special needs, and may have multiple community benefits, and perhaps have demonstrated are not financially self-sustaining and do require.
That self-sustaining, I'm not sure, there's a certain aspect to that, but part of why we say that Little League and soccer are self-sustaining is because we'd say you don't qualify. And we don't qualify because you're not really part of the his rep criteria. It's not that if we said they qualified, they'd say, well, we actually have this additional need. Now, I'll give you an example. Little League has been trying to have a capital program to upgrade and renovate their Sunken Diamond Little League field for a number of years. And whether the city would ever consider a capital contribution is something else, but they're pursuing that through grants because I think they don't really think they qualify as a separate nonprofit. But in any event, I think that what's different here is that it's children and youth programs that have particular needs that align with our social service rather than our community services. And I'm just saying that we need to think about how we would describe that. And we don't have to do that here.
I did want to add that there are the outliers. For example, Project Safety Net would be something we fund. YCS outside of the his rep process we fund, and those sort of lie in between the two.
Yeah. So, and I think certainly are ones we want to continue supporting, and depending on, they're always what they have as their program and their sustainability. But that goes back into the question of, okay, where do we put them and how do we talk about them? And we don't have to put, make force fit an entity into a category where they don't quite fit. We just say, okay, how would we better describe where they do fit? And if you have a starting point, that's often the case of, no, we've over the years said that's a valuable program that we want to support. We don't have to start necessarily with, well, does it meet our criteria? We may want to reflect on how to get to that point. Do we still think that way? And usually when we reflect on, oh, it was for this reason and this reason, and it's still for those reasons. Or if something changed and those reasons went away, maybe we at some point in time reconsider something. But for the most part, those things are being funded because they were thoughtfully supported over an extended period of time because they are meeting some valuable needs. Which bucket they fit in is another question.
Council member, with all respect, can I ask a clarification? Because I thought the purpose of the meeting was to say his rep. His rep is well-defined.
No, that
and-
wasn't the purpose of the meeting. That was a portion of the purpose of the meeting. We had a discussion on wanting to look at our broader definition of human services. And that's why we have these other things in the report. The report addresses a whole bunch of things that aren't in HISRIP. So that was a significant portion of that. And that's a lot of what has led to this conversation, but that's not the boundaries of it, no.
May I just elaborate that I think this is a great conversation and it's going to lead in well into our study session where we try to approach into defining, how do we establish these relationships? How do we, what kind of criteria do we have? What kind of buckets do we have? And layered over that is the, audit review and recommendations of how do we have how do we get these nonprofits and what's the appropriate level of reporting and whatnot? And so I think this is a valuable conversation, and we still have the referral from the council of, whether we want to tie a percentage of the general fund. I think, Chair, that you have, articulated that this is a greater conversation and we're already exceeding that. And so perhaps the best solution is to then focus on the next steps instead of a percentage of the general fund and conclude this referral.
Yeah, and at what point in time and how do we then return with something to the council with a recommendation?
Right.
So the obvious starting place there is to figure out what the buckets are and what we're not counting yet. So we see the kind of the total, because I think that'll give us a better perspective. I think that's all a plus. And I'm not saying that's negative at all.
And when you're saying buckets, you're saying buckets kind of within human services, even if they're not within his rep. Is that it? Okay.
Yes, completely.
Well, and even if they're not wholly in human services.
Yeah, so that's where I just keep having trouble extracting, the relationship with our nonprofit community more broadly and the human services, because I was thinking about it, and for the anticipated study session, I won't go deep into it because that's not our topic, but in terms of the handshake, there are public interest nonprofits that align with the city's missions, and they fit into a whole bunch of buckets. So one of those is sort of our safety net human services. Others could be the community building and belonging. Others could be what I'm calling civics, which is the obligations and duties of citizenship. Arts is one, health could be another. So, but any of those could have human services aspect, to your point. And so I think that, but some of them may not, right? And so having how we extract this and exactly account for it dollar-wise may depend on the particular program of the particular nonprofit, right? Because you could see a nonprofit that might have some within the human services and some without the human services. So is our mission today to try to do what exactly
Well,
with that?
I'd say we as a committee also need to reflect on how much we keep broadening this discussion. And I think going forward, we'll want to try to draw certain boundaries. And with this bucket that's a gray area of ones that have a significant component in human services. But then we're going to have all of these other things that are this broader set that you were talking about that is a worthwhile discussion. But I think that does get outside of the human services discussion. So this assignment was about human services, this referral. We're discovering that there are some gray boundaries, but I don't think we have the direction from council, nor, and I think that it'll cause us to even lose more focus if we try to take on too much in this discussion. And we can still then go back to the council and say, we think we should have a follow-on discussion about these other categories, but that would be in a different discussion, I think.
Yeah, I'm hoping that can be the study session on nonprofits that's coming up later. Because I think of it, what I was describing those categories, not so much as concentric circles, but maybe different
And
categories in parallel, right? Yeah. So, yes, long way of saying yes.
Do yeah.
Well, I thought you were headed on the thread of perhaps getting a little more clarity in terms of what's in the bucket. So for example, to perhaps have staff come back with a revised listing that may expand capital versus operating, includes Magical Bridge. Not sure if there were other revisions that were identified.
Yeah, one was categories of nonprofits that have a significant human services component, whether it's majority or sizable minority, but don't fit as principally a human services funding, such as PATMA and downtown streets.
So the timing of when we come back for the reporting, I think if you're okay to support staff as we evolve this and get back to you. So I just want to put that out there. But what I heard in the potential categorization is capital versus operating, major partners, partners who are not wholly or partially human services, and then partners in this other category that add value to our community. So we will seek to have a better understanding of that and then look through our financial contributions to see. And, you know, like a lot of custom and new reports, it's like, let's put it together and see how it informs us, and then it'll change. So as we look at the data, right, how does that inform our policy decision and our funding decision? So that's the feedback we got today. And also particularly is as for this 1% referral, that we're going to close it out. And it appears based on the summarization that we are funding at least 1% when we broadly define human services.
Yeah, which I don't think is real relevant. The original question is, are we funding at 1% in the way that we previously defined it? So I don't think the 1% is relevant when we change the scope. But I'm good with kind of not fixating on that.
I'm good with that too.
Okay. And I just want to say thanks for that summary and all this discussion. I think it's a really valuable and fruitful discussion, and you know, a lot of this is how do you know, put things in categories that aren't distinct in how they may lie, and so there's a lot of judgment, and that's fine. Yeah. All right, we done? That note, we're adjourned. We're going to our national night out. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. All right. Thanks.